Hello, and welcome to You Are Not the Problem, a podcast on how to move from trauma to possibility.
Together, we will explore the deeper truth. You are not broken. You are not crazy. You're responding exactly as your body was designed to in a world that profits from your disconnection.
This podcast dismantles the myths of the healing industrial complex and dives into the collective unconscious that keeps us stuck in cycles of shame, burnout, and self-blame.
We explore how trauma lives in systems and how rediscovering your intuition, body, and community can become a radical act of resistance.
Because maybe it's not you that needs fixing, maybe it's the world.
This podcast is hosted by three holistic healers.
Hey, I'm Camille, sex and relationship therapist, intuitive tarot reader, and professional witch.
Hello, I'm Doris. I've been a nurse for almost 25 years and a practicing herbalist for 15 years. Now I am a burnout recovery specialist.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm a holistic trauma therapist and an alternative health practitioner specializing in narcissism, abuse, and domestic violence.
In today's episode, we are talking about the reasoning and the why behind the name of the podcast. We want to give context around this specific name and why each of us are passionate about these topics and our expertise in the subject matter. But first, we're going to have some announcements. So we have a few upcoming events. I have a Getting Beyond Burnout workshop that is January 24th at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as well as a Better Sleep webinar that will come up in February at February 7th at 9 a.m. Pacific Time. And then Izzy and Camille both have a Spring Equinox online mini retreat that will be on March 21st from 12 to 3 p.m. Pacific Time.
So we'd love to have you join for any of those. We'll put links and everything in the description or show notes, or you're welcome to reach out to us for more information.
So to start off this conversation, we wanted to kind of get into how this all came about, which is in August, I was driving to Montana, which is a 10-hour drive from where I live. And so I had 10 hours of listening to podcasts, and it really became clear to me that I had a lot of knowledge and expertise and a lot of passion. And I know a couple people who also have very similar passions and knowledge because of our similar but different backgrounds. And we do co-working together every week. And we would do a lot of ranting and very little co-working, but we would talk about these topics all the time. And so it really came around that we wanted to start a podcast so we can give out our expertise and some information about the systems that we struggle in all the time.
And so one of the things that really inspired us with this name, You Are Not the Problem, it came from these conversations that we had through our experiences working in healthcare, or our experiences as, survivors in various forms, or just people who are, part of the healthcare system, and how these systems perpetuate harm. And in my own experience of working in domestic violence, often I would see people coming in and they would share about how they were confused about what they were going through. They weren't sure if, they were the problem. Who's the narcissist here? Is it them? Is it me? Sometimes it's unclear. And that what I often found was people who were coming in, these survivors coming in, they would get so deep into this place of shame and self-blame. And this was something that I struggled with in my own journey of healing from domestic violence as well. And I realized that what was really needed was education, and for people to recognize that they're not the problem, to be able to reduce that shame. And of course, there are times where we are the problem, or, we might engage in problematic behaviors, but that we need to first be able to recognize the ways in which other people or these systems perpetuate harm, and recognize that we aren't the problem, that we are part of a larger system or a generational pattern that continues to perpetuate harm.
Yeah, and I can share a bit about my own story as well. One of the main things I think about was being in graduate school to be a marriage and family therapist. This was happening during COVID. I was in my internship in 2021. Um, and just really spending a lot of time on screens, doing school on screens, seeing clients on screens. Everything was on a screen, and it was just I mean, grad school in general is a lot of burnout, but yeah, it was just feeling like a lot. And I know for me, like it felt like while I was in school learning about mental health and teaching others about it and how to do that, I felt like a lot of times in aspects of my internship, my own mental health was like not supported. And I was really glad that, yeah, I had someone else in my internship with me. And that helped a lot. But I definitely, yeah, kind of just was really struggling during that time. And when I would ask for help from my supervisor or other people, it just felt like a lot of time it was like, just it's hard, like get through it. And it just felt very challenging. Um, Doris and I met after I graduated from grad school, was starting a business, starting a therapy private practice, and met in a holistic business kind of collective and started doing this co-working that I talked about earlier, where we found out we lived somewhat close to each other, met up in person one time, bonded over plants. We went to a went on a plant walk or a hike, and that was very fun. Um, and then it's kind of since then we have been doing co-working every week, which for us looks like getting on Zoom, trying to tell each other what we're accountable for doing, and then working on a lot of that. And that's again where we would have a lot of these conversations, similar backgrounds and experiences, like I said, related to the healthcare system, and also really, yeah, sharing a lot of ways that we wanted to, how to cope, right? Which is the other part of this podcast that we want to.
Yeah, and Izzy and I also met, bonded over plants because we went on a guided plant walk or an herb walk. Um, and we hadn't known each other and both signed up for this herb walk and carpooled there, and then got stuck on the highway for a couple hours. So we had lots of time to connect. And then we started co-working together, separately, and then I invited Izzy in with Camille and I. So then the three of us started this co-working together. So it was just a natural progression from starting of like, oh, me having this idea of wanting to do a podcast, but definitely not wanting to do it on my own, and talking to Izzy and Camille about it. And it was just, and we talk a lot, at the time that we do our co-working about like the struggles that not only we have within these systems of trauma that we experience, but also our clients also experience and struggle in. And that we have a lot of insight because we've all been part of the system, but yet then we are also in service of others in the system. And so we see both sides of it. And we feel like we have a lot of expertise in this and these topics that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I just thought about something in our intro. We talk about this collective unconscious. And what does that really mean here? I think it speaks to how so many of these themes, so many of these experiences, we might feel very alone, or that this is, oh, no one else can understand my story. But that actually so many people have common experiences, that there are these themes, these patterns that emerge within this collective unconscious. And often, you might, if you ever get into like the therapist's break room, which is kind of what this podcast is, we talk about like, oh, I'm noticing this pattern of, I have like many clients who are talking about a similar theme this week, or I wonder what's happening that this one issue keeps coming up in so many sessions all at the same time. And that there's these kind of patterns of struggle or patterns of change and transformation and evolution that start to reveal themselves the deeper you get into this healing work. And it speaks to this concept of the collective unconscious. And I think that because, all three of us working in healthcare in different capacities, we come at this from this different perspective. And I know you, Doris, like you've had a lot of experiences working in healthcare. And I wonder maybe you can share a little bit about like what that was like for you and how you really exited that system.
Yeah, it's hard because coming from a nurse background, like nursing, being a nurse becomes part of who you are because you get such positive kudos of like, oh my God, you're a nurse. And I was a pediatric nurse. And oh my God, you're a pediatric nurse. It's got to be so hard. And so it becomes part of the very fabric of who you are and who your identity is. And so, but your identity is wrapped up into this healthcare system, which is, if you didn't have trauma coming into it, you're certainly exposed and have traumatic experiences during it. And so it becomes this very weird relationship between your work and your professional life and then who you are. And it's hard to untangle yourself from that identity, and because you're losing part of yourself in order to really like start a healing journey, or to when you get to the point like I did where I was like, I can't work in this, not just the system, but I can't work as a nurse anymore. And I didn't for several years after I quit my career, because even the idea of working as a nurse made me physically ill. Like I could not imagine getting a job as a nurse. But that took years before that. Like I was probably 3-4 years before I actually finally quit. I did the deep work of like, who am I without the label as a nurse? And who am I without being a pediatric nurse? And that it's really hard, especially for nurses. Like we're so wrapped up into our, like the nurse being who we are, and it's hard to peel that label off and then be like, who are you really underneath that? And I find that especially with women, and mothers as well, like it's like you give birth and you become this mother, and then that's who your label is, and you forget who you are underneath that. And it's the same with nurses, where a lot of times we become that nurse whether we're on shift or not shift, or in our personal lives. And but you're entwined with that trauma. Like you bring that trauma home with you, and it becomes really difficult to unwind and those things from your professional to your personal life. And so this is really hard.
Yeah, and these systems like create this dynamic where you are kind of pushed to do that, right? When you work in healthcare, you're pushed to, oh, you need to give and give and give and give. And of course, that's part of the underpinning of working in a healing profession. That's what we're here to do, right? We're here to help other people. We're here to give support, and it can lead to, well, at what point do we also receive, or how do we fill our own cups? And so when I think about this concept of you are not the problem, right? That when you work in healthcare, we are put in this position of having to basically empty ourselves in service. And then we, wake up one day and we wonder why we're burned out and exhausted. And that it's a kind of a reckoning, I think, is needed for us to redefine what it means to be in service, or redefine what it means to be in a healing profession. That it isn't about endless giving, that we also have to be really conscientious of how we are taking care of ourselves, that we have to find spaces where we can fill our cup and continue to be in service, because otherwise, no one can survive that. That's why you have such high percentages of therapists who don't last more than 5 years out of graduate school.
Yeah, and there's a lot of new grad nurses that quit within the first couple of years of being a nurse, and which is horrible because you end up having a lot of student loans and then not being able to work in the field that you chose. but also like healthcare is ran as a business, which it under capitalism is an extraction, and we don't see ourselves as the resource that's being extracted from, but that's exactly what it is. Like healthcare and the system is extracting our resources, which is our labor and our time and energy. And then when we're done, when we're burned out, it's like, whatever. And because there's all these new grads coming up that they, right. So there's no, like, there's no retention of the experience that you have. And but there has to be a shift in how you see yourself, your labor and your energy and your time, and giving it to a system that will just extract everything from you and then leave you with a chronic illness. And I don't know a nurse that does not have a chronic illness. And it's a lot of it's because of the chronic stress and trauma that we're exposed to, that the system doesn't even acknowledge that exists.
And that lack of acknowledgement, I think, is where the real harm is. And that I think is a big intention for why we wanted to start this podcast, where people could feel a space where they are acknowledged in, oh, someone sees the ways in which I've experienced harm. Because often we emerge from these situations of harm and we're not validated in our experience. And we're left to think, oh, it must be me. Maybe I'm deficient in some way, or I didn't work hard enough. I didn't try hard enough. You know, I wasn't giving enough. I wasn't compassionate enough. I didn't self-care enough. And that's not the problem, right?
Yeah.
That self-care isn't going to just fix all of these things, you know, that we actually need to look at the systems of harm and recognize the ways in which maybe we need to burn it all down and start again.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, the other thing that's sort of important is that, like, yes, we all have or do, or we're trained in working in healthcare systems. And I think we've all had to find things outside of that to help us. Not that there aren't helpful things, but that's not the only place to find ways out of burnout or community or other things. Which I think, again, like, they didn't talk about that in school to me. uh,
And there's so many different systems of harm that we live in that you don't even recognize because it's become so normalized. And so like when we started breaking down topics, when we're talking in our co-working sessions, like we have so much material that we can talk about because the whole system is normalized, because they don't, like, the system doesn't want you to recognize that it's a problem when it can extract your labor and your emotions and your time and your energy. And
yeah. Well, it encourages like infighting, right? It's like, oh, you're not doing, you took time off. Oh, well, now I have to work harder. And it's like, no, that, because then I think people get really resentful, or you get told like, oh, you're not a good nurse or a therapist or this or that if you do this way of coping. And again, yeah, to me, it's clear that that is like because of the challenging system that we're in, that it kind of creates that. But it's still like just as harmful, especially when that is your identity.
And even the ways in which our healthcare system in America is set up as a profit-making machine. And so we literally profit off of illness. And so we're actually not incentivized for people to heal and get better, because then the healthcare system would go bankrupt if we were all healthy. And I think that isn't talked about enough, right? The ways in which that profit and money underlying health leads to this corruption. And a step away from the real intention of this work is that to find balance and wholeness and healing within. And this is something that I think is such a big premise of my work in helping people discover that healing potential within themselves. And I think is also a big intention of this podcast, to help people, to empower people to discover that inside of themselves, that of course we need support sometimes. We need other people to help us and give us that different perspective or support us during times of challenge. And I think that when we discover that empowerment within ourselves, that can also be so profound to recognize, oh, I actually have a lot of capacity, or I can work on this internally, or I can break this pattern.
Yeah, because this, especially the healthcare system, and I think most of the systems that we live in, are designed for you to give away your power to some expert, right? And taking the healthcare system as an example, we are taught to give all of our power to an MD or a provider. And that MD only has 10, 15 minutes with you. Like, how much of a relationship are you building with them? You're not. And how deeply can they go into your history and the whole context of what might be contributing to this one problem? Like, it can't. They are completely unable to do so. And yet, sometimes there's a lot of times there's this resistance from the provider when a patient comes to them with like either a complex issue where it's not like you check off these boxes and here's your diagnosis and here's your pill and you can go about your business. Or if you were saying, I come in and I don't want to take 20 pills and I want to do these alternative methods, because they're not always very open to that as well.
It's not like an easy answer, right? It's like, oh no, that's hard. That's nuanced, that's complex, it's different across different people.
Yeah.
And I think like for all of us, like we all have operated in expert roles and we have all experienced, right, the client patient side of feeling not validated, not heard, totally just like walked all over. And I think that that's like why it's so important to each of us to like talk about this. That again, right? No, you as an individual are not the problem. Often you know your body better than anyone else, better than any doctor ever will, because you spend every day with your body, whether you want to or not. And I think that, yeah, that's definitely something I have to. It's like, oh yeah, I am the expert. Oh my. Again, not that we can't learn from other people or have community, receive support and validation from other people, but that actually I am the expert in health and wellness, and I can seek other people to help me inform that.
And especially as women, we're taught how, from a very young age, to not listen to ourselves, not listen to our intuition, not listen to our boundaries, not listen to any piece, and to give our power to these positions of authority. And
Usually men.
yes.
Oh, the pages.
Just right. What are the systems that we're talking about? And so then it takes years to relearn essentially that we have that power and we can take that back, and that you have to fight the system a lot of times. And it's an uphill battle, and it's really hard to access community sometimes around that, because doing it all on your own is really, really hard.
Well, it's like then you have to like reinvent the wheel, right? If everyone had to do it all on their own, you would never do it. Like it would never happen, or you're just going to be exhausted. So yeah, we can really help each other by sharing things that worked or what didn't, or I think a lot of that like peer to peer, especially as women, is like very helpful.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I didn't know.
Well, and it makes me think of, so many women's health issues that are basically ignored or, just said as, oh, you're just, it's psychological.
Yeah.
Oh, it's in your head. I can't tell you.
Hysterical.
Right.
Or it's like, oh, that's inconvenient for the medical system. We didn't study that, sorry.
Yeah, we don't study the female body. It's too much work.
Space everything on an 18-year-old male.
And it's like, oh yeah, that's why the system's not working for us. it was never meant to, right? That's like the really unfortunate part. Is like, oh, the system is working how it was always intended, and it was that I was not supposed to be part of that system.
Yeah. And so a lot of our intention with this podcast is to name, like talk about the different systems, like name the problems, and then give tools and education around what you can do about the system that you're living in to empower you to make changes in your own life, which will then kind of ripple out and will eventually change the system. But if you don't, if you're unconscious about the system that you're living in because you don't even have the words to describe it, so that's a lot of what we're doing is we're giving the words to describe the system you live in and the harm that it's causing and how you're trying to navigate that when you don't even recognize that you're trying to navigate it.
And I think that speaks to like this normalization that often happens. I'm just thinking of so many clients who come to me and talk about how they were abused or they were, harmed in their family. And they'll sit in front of me and talk about how they were, physically beaten. And they will wonder like, oh, but that's just what happens in every family, right? I thought this is just normal, right? People beat their kids. This is just what happens. And they're shocked when I say, oh no, that's abuse. And it's just that like disconnect for so many of us that because we're so immersed in these systems or in these dysfunctional dynamics, we just think this is the way it is. And then we are in that and thinking, well, it must be me that's the problem because I'm too sensitive, or because
or you've been told, right? So like, no,
like you're too much.
It's you problem,
right?
Yeah.
Well, and so I was in my previous marriage. It took me 5 years of therapy to realize that I was in a DV situation in my marriage because it wasn't like a
domestic violence.
Oh, sorry. Yes, domestic violence. It wasn't like the physical domestic violence, but it was the emotional and psychological. And it took me years of therapy, even, and that was part of like my work of kind of figuring those pieces out. But you don't like, and I wasn't not aware of domestic violence, but it's hard to recognize it when you're in it because it's all so normalized.
Yeah.
Well, it makes me think of something I actually was reading just earlier today about how, someone in this therapist group I was in talking about how they'll have someone who is able to identify that they're, in a domestic violence relationship, but they can't leave. They're struggling to leave. And, it's that element of, okay, what happens though when actually I can name the problem or I can name like, oh, this is what's hurting me, but I feel stuck in that, or I don't know how to get out. I don't know how to, break that trauma bond or, really, take that step away or make change. And I think a lot of that comes also from the fear, that we're afraid of doing something different when so many of these things are normalized.
And that's a lot with nurses as well, because even when you want to leave, it can be really hard, not just because it's part of your identity, but the money's good. Usually you're like you have the benefits, and which is also a whole system of harm where we don't have universal health care and your healthcare benefits are tied to your job. So you're stuck living or working in these abusive and toxic jobs. And sometimes it's not, well, I mean, thinking of frontline staff who work in ERs, like they're assaulted all the time. And they're not protected by the hospital and the system. And so even when you want to leave a situation like that, it's hard. And I know nurses who are waiting until retirement and they're just like eking by as much as they can until they can retire because they don't have any other choice.
Yeah. And I think that it's this question that's often asked for people when they're in, toxic workplace or toxic relationship or toxic family, whatever it is, people often ask, like, well, why don't they leave? Why don't they
It's
leave?
like, go where? Like, are
Right.
you gonna house them? You gonna pay for it? Who's gonna shelter them? Right? Then what? Like that we right, like some businesses like do that, some healthcare providers do that, but yeah, we don't have great systems in place to care for people to make their way out of abusive systems.
Right. And it's maybe rather than asking why don't they leave, maybe we should ask, why don't we have systems that support people to leave? Or why do we have systems that perpetuate harm in the first place?
Yeah.
Maybe we should change that.
Right. Because like you're saying, right, like, okay, people go into nursing and then they do it and then it creates chronic illness and then you can't leave nursing because
you need the health
you
insurance.
need the health insurance and you like see every day like the pros and cons of health insurance and how it all works. And then it's like, oh, I'm just gonna like see what happens. I'm gonna leave my job and see and have to pay for insurance on my own or figure it out or just not go to the doctor. Right? A lot of people do that. I'm like, okay, I guess I can't afford to be sick. I guess I just won't be, right? Like, which doesn't work. But
well, and as nurses, we're also taught, and generation, so I'm the tail end of Gen X, we were taught just to push through, buck up, suck up, and do it, and then I see everyone's sick. Like, because at some point your body is like, I can't keep pushing through physically, and not just because of the physical work, but there's just that the mental and emotional stress that you end up carrying around with you, because you don't just leave it at work. No matter what work you do, you don't just leave your work at home or at work. You take it with you everywhere. And it's like this huge backpack, this huge weight that you carry around with you every day. And at some point, your body's like, no,
it's really heavy. Can't do it anymore. And even if you leave the work, right? It's like, oh, backpack didn't go anywhere. Still here. Now
it's lighter.
Yeah.
It feels better, but it's still there.
Or like, I got really used to carrying it. So I guess it's fine. So yeah, how do we talk about then or transition into like what helps, right? I know we talked about like naming it. We've talked about some of the more like, yeah, you're not the problem, right? You're not the only one that's going through this. But like, what else?
But it makes me think of, how there's two truths in when I think about self-care. That yes, self-care is actually really important. We need to empower ourselves to, know that we can care for ourselves and we do have to fill our cup and we do have to take that intentional time, and we can't just, self-care and not address the problem, right? I think it kind of shifts the burden of responsibility onto the individual that says, oh, you just need to take better care of yourself so that you can remain in this dysfunction.
How many continuing education credits have you taken about self-care, right? Like this is the irony is that like we have to learn about things for work to maintain our licenses and then it's just like, yeah, just take a bubble bath. And then
just do some deep breathing and everything will be fine.
Yeah, to me, I'm like self-care is preventative. But if you're in burnout, that's not gonna do anything.
Right. So like if you're in the fire, like putting a cup of water on your house burning down is not actually gonna.
It's not it. Yeah.
And I think it again like kind of shifts the burden of responsibility onto the individual and it prevents us from being able to say, hey, I wonder maybe we should change why people are getting burned out, why people are feeling.
We're not just dealing with the symptoms, we're dealing with the
cause. Yeah. And I think that's what it can be so frustrating when you work in healthcare. People are coming in and I'm just like trying to put the fire out with this cup of water.
You got like a single band-aid for them.
Right. Like, look out there. Yeah. They're hemorrhaging and you're like, here's your band-aid. I hope that helps.
And then we put people right back into the systems that harm them. It makes me think of, healthcare for people who are unhoused, that they'll come into the ER and, they'll patch them up and then they send them right back out. And then,
Oh, yeah, I've discharged people from the floor to a cab where they just drop them off on the street somewhere. and they have had MRSA. But at some point, the hospital's like, we can't keep them because we're not, like, they've been through treatment. But when it comes to discharge, you're like, here's discharging them back to the street, like, because there's no transitional housing for them to go to, because our system doesn't put money and emphasis on social issues and education. And so there is no transitional housing for people who need it.
Yeah. Like for me, like part of the reason why I went to grad school to become a marriage and family therapist is because I worked at a nonprofit doing family law. So like highly contested custody cases. And I saw all of these like parental dynamics impacting their kids. And I was like, I'll be a therapist and then I can like be on the front end. And now I'm a therapist and I'm like, no. Like we made it like one step closer. But like the front end is the system. And sometimes like the culture too. And like I said, right, we have a lot of abusive systems. It's not just the healthcare system. And even just workplaces that aren't healthcare are very abusive and not very consensual and not very boundaried in any way. And you get really punished for having any kind of boundaries.
Because capitalism doesn't want you to have boundaries. But it's that shift in thinking of, you think of yourself as an individual, but really you don't think of yourself as labor, which is what we are. And the system is extracting that labor. And it takes a shift to think about that, because our culture in America, we're so rugged individual, but really we're part of a community that's being exploited for our labor and time and energy. And it doesn't matter like what class you are, because I've talked to people who work for Amazon, and they're like working 60 hours a week or more. And it's like, and the intent is to burn them out. So they leave. So it doesn't matter like what kind of job you have, the intent is the same from the system.
But I think it brings me back to, all this education and how that's of course, this big intention in this podcast is to help people be able to understand like what the heck is even going on here. And I think another big piece of this is also trying to address the shame. And so I think a big part of addressing shame is working with self-compassion and coming to that recognition that my core self, I believe, every single one of us has a core self that is good, that is compassionate and confident and clear and capable. And it's for us to come back to that wise self and to recognize that we have this core goodness within us and heal this shaming wound that keeps us stuck in these cycles. That I find shame is often the biggest piece that keeps people perpetually in systems of harm, because it makes us think, oh, it must be me, it must be my fault. And so when we can just work on the shame piece, we can shift a lot of these cycles that people get stuck in.
Well, and then not only do we receive a lot of shame, but then we think that's how we control other people. And so we shame other people and we perpetuate that harm onto other people. And so then it becomes this cycle of harm for everyone.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you step back from that?
Yeah. And I think right now we're talking a lot about like the macro ways of doing this, right? Like fight the system, protest, right? Or like advocate for yourself, or right, like have people come with you to help advocate, or recognize the system is harmful and choose to try to interact with it as little as possible, or like to work for you. But I'm also like, I guess I can start with kind of like, I want to know like the micro, like what do you do day to day? Or like when you were so burned out, like what was the thing that was helpful. And like I said, I'll start with me. Like I said, I was on screens like 12 hours a day during doing grad school and meetings and clients and other things. And I had just bought a house with an empty yard, and I was like, I'm gonna make the most epic garden. Because I like it was so helpful for me to just like go outside, like look at the sunlight, touch grass, literally. And to like I think also, yeah, as a therapist, so much of the work we do is like abstract or like intangible. It's very hard to hold and like see progress unless someone tells you. Um, and whereas like for me, like working with plants or even just transforming our yard, ripping out the grass, putting in other stuff, it was like so tangible. I was like, okay, yesterday we have like grass. Today I did this, and then we ripped out the grass, and now there's a tree there. Like it was just very helpful to me to be able to see progress in like a different way. And yeah, and just also have something that wasn't on a screen, like to be honest. But I think a lot of us felt that for points during like lockdown pandemic times was like, yeah, there's so many things you can do online. I'm a millennial. I love the internet. I've lived on the internet for many years. And like I have to do some things in real life, in person, that's not just on a screen. And yeah, and also like that helped me find community, or I would watch YouTube, other people gardening and like learn from them and then be like, okay, now I have to go outside and do it. I can't just watch someone else do it, like going out and doing it. And I think it also taught me like a lot of things about like it's okay to fail or like you're learning. I think in adulthood, like a lot of times we're like, no, I got it. And I kind of do everything. I'm good. You'll see as we start a podcast, you'll be like, they're learning. But yeah, in gardening, it was like, oh yeah, oh, no, that didn't work at all. Or like, oh no, that plant got totally eaten by insects. And I think like when we talk about systems, I also think in my own gardening, like my system now of gardening is very different than my system when I started, which was much more like capitalism or like monocropping. Or I want to like not talk too much about this, but just saying that like even working with plants and like learning how to like help nurture them, but also that like I can only do so much. Like plants want to grow. If you find the right space for them, they'll usually be happy and grow. But that like trying to force plants to grow in a certain area because I think it looks good.
Mhm.
It's not it. Like you have to work so hard to like fight against some of those things. And I think like I'm like there's lots of lessons about that, like in our day-to-day life about like how do you work with the things that are already there, or how do you make the system work for you?
And how do you make your own ecosystem? Like that's
Yeah,
really what
right.
it is. Like versus having I'm just having a monocrop.
Yeah.
All I
Just
do
all corn. Just that's it. That's all we're gonna eat.
right. And all you're like, all I'm going to do is exercise to try to combat my stress and
And
burnout.
you're like, I'll just do it 4 hours a day. Like, right? Like, okay.
But really is what you're trying to do is you need to build an ecosystem that
Yes.
involves a lot of different things.
Yeah,
like
right.
your community and your self-care tools and advocating for yourself. Like it's not just one thing. There's
Yeah.
not just one key where you like magically now I'm not burned out. Now I'm not doing like I'm perfect. Things are great. But the system itself sucks. But you know, I'm fine.
Yeah. And I
And
think it's like that, like someone telling you that when you're burned out, you're like, I want to swear right now, but I'm not going to. Where you're like, cool. How? Right? Where it's like, sounds great. Like, you gonna tell me like what to do? But I think that also is like the thing we have to break ourselves from. It's like, no, like try not to rely on anyone to tell you what to do. Right. Hopefully we inspire you perhaps to do some different things, but that like again, I feel like my belief system is like you know yourself best and like you know what's gonna work for you and like try different things and see what helps. And like you said, have hopefully you have a lot of things that are part of your self-care practice, or like a lot of things that help you feel like yourself, like you're happy to be here and things like that. And that way, when maybe one of them goes wrong or you can't do it or you're more burned out, you at least know, okay, here's my like things that I normally do. And let me like get back into that because I know they're helpful.
Yeah, another thing that came up for me as you were sharing that, Camille, was about how when we are stuck in shame, that we think that, oh, I need to be perfect.
Yeah, I just have to try harder. I just gotta do it more.
Yeah, I need to do it exactly right the first time. And I think in that sometimes we don't give ourselves space to be a beginner.
Well, there's no culture to fail, right? Like we have to do it once and be perfect and things will be fine. And we don't support each other to fail.
Yeah, and like, guess what, guys? There's no actual like it does in school, but like outside school, like and like death, some people consider failure.
But then
you're moved on, so maybe have different priorities. But like, yeah, to me, I'm like, no, failure is like a construct. That's like, yeah, you can do things and not be happy with your result. I like to bake. Sometimes I'm like, that wasn't the best one I've done. But there's so many different factors to create. What was the weather that day? Is that why your pastry is weird? Like that you don't actually have control over.
And it brings me to the concept of like humility, that I think what is really deeper in humility is the conception that, I know there are things greater than me that actually I cannot control. It like also reminds me of the serenity prayer used in Alcoholics Anonymous, that, can I have that wisdom to know, that there are things I can control. There are also things that I cannot control. And that real wisdom is knowing the difference. That I think sometimes we get stuck in these places of thinking, that I can control this, or that, that this is within my power, when actually it's really not, right? There are these bigger systems at play that we cannot control. And that by understanding that, we can recognize, oh, actually, I'm not the problem here because I can't, solve, these huge problems in our society. But that, being in that space of humility and recognizing, it's okay for me to not be able to solve world hunger or, poverty.
What?
Right.
It's on that yard. Climate change.
But on the flip side of that too, it's also
everyone's fault.
and knowing and understand, like, because from my background, there's a fair amount of nurses who are like, well, I can't do anything about the system, so I'm just not going to do anything.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of giving up of your being able to advocate, not just like we're great at advocating for our patients, but we're really shitty about advocating for ourselves. And so it's finding that balance and being able to like, okay, the system is really shitty right now. I can only control myself and make myself feel better. And then I can advocate to create change in the system. And so, but if you look at the big system, it's overwhelming. So then you shut down. So, but it's like finding that balance and knowing what you can control and then looking at what you can change as well. So,
yeah.
But I think you touched on like how humility is not apathy, right? Sometimes people think like, oh, I want to be humble and just, like that there's like, that's like being meek. That means being, I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just going to like, stay back and be quiet, right? And be almost apathetic about a problem, right? That's not what that means. It means, I'm going to recognize that I am just one person, but that doesn't mean that I can't also say something, or I can't also make an effort, or that I can't also, try and get support from other people, or, try to reach out and, really address this on a larger scale, but that, it's holding both truths.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to me, I'm like, I think apathy is like a symptom of burnout. Like when I really think about it, it's like, yeah, sometimes if you try to go up against the system, or that you feel like you are the problem, that it's like, yeah, you just start to give up. because it's like, I guess I'm just the problem. Like, oh well, like, so I think that's also part of why it's so important for us to talk about, like, no, not true. And that if you do feel apathetic about things, yeah, I bet you didn't always feel that.
Right.
I think that was a good mic drop maybe for us to.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thanks for joining us for our first episode. You can join us for a new theme every month in our unhinged exploration of trauma, power, and what it really means to heal.
And remember, you are not the problem.
Unless you are.